So I'm really happy to be here. I've known a lot of the folks here at ASU for a long time and had never had a chance to come visit. So I appreciate you listening to what I have to say today and engaging, and more importantly, engaging in a discussion about it. So what I'm presenting today is something that I'm currently working on with an undergraduate student, and we are working toward creating a manuscript with an autoethnography of her experiences, particularly around race and racism and classism, and moving into the role of a so-called non-traditional student now at Clemson University. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this came about first, and then share with you kind of what we're doing to create this project, and ask for your input and guidance and where to move forward. So this project is helping me to explore some new theoretical and methodological ground. As Jeremy mentioned, social capital has been something that I have done a lot in the past with foundation in my NSF Career Award. And now I'm beginning to look at what other forms of capital students may bring to their engineering education, and use some critical theory to examine how the structures and the systems around engineering education affect students' experiences. So I'm bringing in with this project some critical theory and community cultural wealth, which is a part or an offshoot of critical theory. Also exploring some new methodological ground. As some of you know, here we've been involved in some of the things that have been going on in the narrative inquiry community. I've done a little bit of work in narrative analysis, and this project actually started off as a narrative project, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. It's morphed into an autoethnography, and so this is all new to me. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I met Siobhan, who is the student that I'm working with on this autoethnography. I met Siobhan when she was a participant in another research study that I was conducting. And after interviewing her for that, in the process of interviewing her for that, she shared an amazing story of how she came to be an engineering student at Clemson. And I really felt like that story needed to be told. And I wanted to think about how I could use my own privilege, my privileged status, to help give voice to her story. So actually, after interviewing her twice, I started to outline a narrative paper about Siobhan's story. And I was feeling really excited about it. I was feeling excited about the message that it could bring to the community. But there was something that was nagging me about this idea of using someone else's story for my gain. And essentially, because we all know, publication is it would be the reward there. And so I thought about something that Sean Jordan said when he came to visit my research group. And one of the things that we talked about with my research group when Sean was at Clemson was he talked about doing research to give and not to take. And that has really stuck with us as a mantra in my research group. And so I started really to think about, I felt like my intentions were good in trying to give voice to Siobhan's story, but I also felt like if I was going to do research to give and not to take, that I needed to take it a step further. So I actually had an interesting conversation with Joe Walther, and we started talking about some autoethnography that he had been involved in with a student. And so I then talked to Siobhan, told her what I was thinking about, and asked her if she would be interested in collaborating with me on a manuscript, on a paper. And it turns out that writing is one of her pastimes, her hobbies. And so you'll see in a few minutes exactly how much of a good fit that was. So it really turned out to be a good situation, because I was then able to hire Siobhan as an undergraduate researcher in my group, and this is one of the projects that we're working on together. So I wanted to start out with talking about some of the theory and the methods before we get into the autoethnography. So I know this breaks all these slides, all of my slides, break all the rules for the number of words per slide, but I think that there are some things I didn't want to get wrong. First of all, about the theory, and then secondly, there's going to be a lot of places where I'm actually showing you what Siobhan has written. And so I didn't want to, I wanted to give her voice to that. So critical race theory, there's 5 tenets, and one of them is about the intersectionality of race and racism with other forms of subordination like class and gender. And one of the things that people say about critical race theory is that racism is central, endemic, and permanent, and a fundamental part of defining and explaining how U.S. society functions. CRT, or critical race theory, also challenges the dominant ideology, claims of meritocracy, which is that your reward or your achievement is directly in proportion to the effort that you exert, color blindness, race neutrality, and equal opportunity. So we're challenging those ideologies. CRT also has a commitment to social justice. So it has an aspect, when you use CRT, of working to try to eliminate racism, sexism, classism, and empower communities of color and other subordinated groups. And there's this idea of the centrality of experiential knowledge. So we are looking at the experiential knowledge of students of color, in this particular case, as being legitimate, appropriate, and critical to understanding and analyzing and teaching about racial subordination. So this is where we're giving voice to the lived experience of people of color. And it also comes from an interdisciplinary perspective, where we're crossing boundaries, and there's both the historical and contemporary context. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about the historical context that goes into this. Okay, so Siobhan, the way that she describes herself, when she was talking about herself initially, was that she was a young black girl from the ghetto. She's now also considers herself to be a non-traditional student. She's 37 years old. She's the mother of 2 children, one of whom is a freshman in high school. So I want to plunk you down into the historical context of where and when Siobhan grew up, her educational experiences that have framed the historical context, I should say, that have framed her educational experiences. So Kansas City, Missouri. The Kansas City, Missouri KCMSD, which I'm just going to talk about Kansas City, I think, is the Kansas City, Missouri School District. After the Supreme Court ruling in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education, Kansas City, let's say they did a lot to circumvent desegregating their schools. I found out after talking to Siobhan about, in the first interview, that when I looked up Kansas City, Missouri in this, that it's actually a very famous case study. around education. So there's actually been a number of articles and books that have been written about this Kansas City experiment, as it was called. So in Kansas City, throughout the decades from 1954 on until Siobhan was a student and graduated in the 90s, it really was a black-white binary in terms of racial distribution. So I'm going to, while I acknowledge that there are those two groups are certainly not the only important ones in U.S. society, in Kansas City, those were the two groups that we'll be talking about. So after the 1954 ruling, Kansas City adopted this neighborhood schools program. So instead of saying that black students had to go to these schools and white students had to go to these schools, they said everybody has to go to the school that lives in their neighborhood. The thing is, the neighborhoods were segregated, right? So it really didn't do much. But they also then boasted that they had transitioned to integrated schools that had been accomplished smoothly and effectively. And really what they did was, it was just tokenism. So there were some schools where they would take like 10 black students, bus them to a white school, keep them in a separate classroom, separate lunch, separate recess, didn't interact with the white students, and that's what they were calling desegregation in Kansas City. So that was in the 60s, or actually right after the Brown versus Board of Education. So there's a lot of other interesting history that involves real estate practices and blockbusting, and how these schools, these neighborhood schools, became to be so segregated. I'm going to jump to the 1984 district court ruling, where they decided that the segregated school systems still existed in the Kansas City, Missouri school district in 1984. And that's when they started pouring money from the state to the tune of $250 million in the mid-'80s into a magnet school program, where they were trying to attract white students who lived in the suburbs to entice them to come to the schools in Kansas City. And so this started around 1986, and the beginning of the end was right around 1997, when Siobhan was in high school. So this is where we find Siobhan's story. So let me talk a bit. Yes.
This question, was the reverse busing also intact, or was it more so the white students coming to?
They were putting black students in white schools and keeping them separate. Oh, yeah, I'm going to talk a lot more about that. Okay, yeah. So this is just sort of setting the stage. Okay, so let me talk a little bit then about autoethnography and what I've come to understand about autoethnography and what we're working on with that. So autoethnography is related to autobiography, narrative, and ethnography, and there's multiple ways of doing this. The way that we've adopted is by Ellis and Botcher, that talks about autoethnography being both a process and a product. So right now we're going through the process, and we are creating a manuscript that will be the product. So autoethnography seeks to connect the personal to the cultural context, and it illustrates a facet of a cultural experience. One of the ways that autoethnography is described that we've adopted is as of layered accounts. So I'm trying to convey this to you in a presentation, which is, we'll see if it works or not, right? I'm trying to convey this to you in a presentation format of something that's going to happen in a manuscript. And so these layered accounts are going to be talking about this background of what's happening in Kansas City, what's happening with Siobhan, how it impacts her educational experience, and eventually her journey to engineering. And we're going to be focusing on what Ellis and Botcher call epiphanies, which are these remembered moments where nothing is the same afterwards. And it's something that significantly impacted the trajectory of a person's life. So we've got these, we've identified 4 epiphanies or 4 scenes that I'm going to try to pull you as the audience in and out of. So the way that we're doing autoethnography, we're using both we're using first, second, and third person. So first person are the accounts that Siobhan herself has written. These are designed to be aesthetic and evocative, thick descriptions. The second person accounts are going to bring readers or audience members to the scenes of these epiphanies of her educational experience. And the third person accounts are going to use to establish this historical context. And we've identified, I'll talk about in a minute a little bit about all of the data that we're using. But from the data that we're using, we've identified 4 epiphanies or scenes. The first is we're calling living in a dome. The second is busing and the black quota system, which you'll find out about in a minute. The last one, or the third one, is dropping out and enrolling. And the last one, I haven't decided yet exactly about the wording, but it's essentially her experiences as a non-traditional student. So I'm going to walk you through the first 2 in pretty good detail. I'm going to talk a little bit about the dropping out and enrolling, and not going to talk at this point about her experiences as a non-traditional student, and I'll tell you why when I get to the quality implications for autoethnography. So these are so Patton identifies certain quality measures in autoethnography as reflexivity, substantive contribution, aesthetic merit, impact, expression of reality, and then we've added also relational ethics. And this relational ethics piece is the reason why I'm not talking about her current experiences right now. So in terms of reflexivity, this is what Patton asked, like, how has the author's subjectivity been both a producer and a product of this text? And we're working on, I'm working on that with Siobhan right now. Is there adequate self-awareness and self-exposure in the work? The substantive contribution simply asks, does this piece contribute to our understanding of social life? For aesthetic merit, how does the use of creative analytic practices open up the text and invite interpretive responses? Is the text artistically shaped, satisfying? And I love the last piece because this sets a bar that I think we can reach as not boring. For the impact, does this affect me emotionally, intellectually? Does it generate new questions? Does it move me to action? To what uses might I put the story? The expression of reality is about, does this really give you a sense of a lived experience? Does it seem true? Does it seem credible? And does it seem real? And then the relational ethics piece, ask what are the potential, both the promise and the problems of implicating other people in the work. Other people that are, in this case, part of Siobhan's story. And what do we do to sufficiently protect those identities? So in 2 examples, first of all, we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about Siobhan's mother, who, while she was growing up, was a drug addict. And this is a central part of Siobhan's story. It's inseparable from the rest of her experience. Her mother is no longer addicted, and she has a good relationship with Siobhan. So as Siobhan was writing these pieces, and as we were discussing what we might include and what we might leave out of a manuscript that we created, we've had her mother look at the passages that we've written and gotten her blessing to proceed with that. And another thing in terms of the relational ethics, when I start talking about some of the data that we're using, we've got some interesting interesting, letters, correspondences that Siobhan has had with administrators at Clemson that are not necessarily positive. And we are working on how to deal with the relational ethics of those, to protect those people's identities, but also to let them know what that impact has been on her story and how to handle that. So I'm not presenting that yet. So, yes.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I'm not very familiar with autoethnography as a method. That sounds fascinating. So my question is it? I mean, I'm thinking through this. I mean, so I understand with you and Siobhan, but is this a common way of doing autoethnography?
That's a good question.
Where one person helps, because it seems like it could be very common that the people with the most interesting stories to tell aren't skilled in the methodology of how to present it in a rigorous
Right.
and appropriate way.
Yeah. So often autoethnography is done by someone who's a researcher, right? So you might use your own experience. I'm collaborating with Siobhan, and in essence, like using the privilege that I have to be able to know how to submit this to a journal, to construct a manuscript, to do these things in a collaboration with her to try to give voice to her story. Right. And so I think that so this has happened, like I know Joe Walther and Nikki Sochaka from University of Georgia published a paper with an undergraduate doing an autoethnography at ASEE a year ago, I think. So autoethnography is not necessarily designed to be done this way, but we're doing it together, and in the manuscript I'm also going to include my positionality and my piece and what my motivations and reasons are for working with this.
Yeah, one quick thing too.
Yeah.
So that it's really cool. But I mean, so I can imagine the case right now, and I definitely understand when you're talking about Siobhan and you in a position of privilege and being able to share her story. But even just in a more general autoethnography context, it's not always privilege that separates the people from being able to tell their story, right? And so it's interesting to think about how a researcher can partner in whatever the context is. Here, it's a privilege differential, but that seems like it has implications for lots of other stories that need to be told.
And that's why, yes, and as I mentioned before, I started out with this as a narrative.
Right.
And there was something about it that I didn't feel quite right. Sean, did you have a comment?
I had a follow-up question. So I know Joe and Nikki have also done some collaborative autoethnography.
Yes, and that's a little bit different. So collaborative autoethnography is really where, and I think that, I know Nikki published something in JEE about this, where it was two researchers both putting their autoethnographic lens onto a particular problem. I chose not to do that with this story because I wanted to give voice to Siobhan's story and not make it about me. We started down that path for a little bit, and I was like, oh, well, Julie's an engineering education researcher and has experience and blah, 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 blah. And then I was like, no, this is not about me. This is about, basically thinking about from the critical race theory perspective, giving voice and legitimizing her experiential knowledge. So we used a number of different kinds of data. So there were interview transcripts from those first two interviews that I did when she was actually a participant in another study. We have her chronological accounts from memory. I asked her to start as early as she could remember, which was age 4. And she is a prolific writer. So far, she's given me 40 pages, and I checked my email right before the presentation, and there was more in my inbox. So At this point, what we've looked at this, she remembers things in very detailed accounts, and we're pulling out and extracting together what those epiphanies are and working around that. We also have done things like used an annotated map. So this is a map of the Kansas City, Missouri school district at the time, and she drew in by hand all the different schools that she attended, which is part of her story. She was moved around from school to school. She also drew in where she lived in the housing project of Holy Temple Homes. And my little, I had a circle that was supposed to show up, but she lived on this, she lived right about there, and from that point she could see the stadiums for the Kansas City sports team. So I'll talk about it in a minute. This is going to show up again. And then we also have these letters and some documents from university administrators and other things that we're working with.
So I'm curious about how might this reflective process change the person, or how, for good or bad, right? So sometimes reliving certain experiences might be painful and
Yes.
may need some work in terms of processing them, or sometimes you may feel like liberated. It's like finally somebody is interested in my story. Do you have any insight on
So she has described it as being cathartic.
Okay.
And that's why she keeps writing.
Okay.
And I from the beginning I said, you just start writing.
Okay.
Because I've interviewed you and I have a sense of your story, but write in as much detail as you remember. And she's doing the writing, and then she's not looking back at what she wrote and refining it and everything. It's just, she's just getting it out there, stream of consciousness. Yeah.
When I understand those reflections looking back years ago, it's not, some of those reflections may not, is it, you're just capturing what she believes, or her own experience, so it's not necessarily like too influenced by what her experiences are throughout the years?
I understand what you're asking. And so what we talked about was for her to go through and write about her experiences as she felt at the time, with trying not to layer on what she may know now as an adult, but thinking about how she felt and the experiences that she had at the time. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. It may become clearer as we go along. All right. So let's talk about living in a dome. So Siobhan grew up in the Holy Temple Homes, which she described as a dome. This neighborhood was situated so that the residents could see both the Kansas City Royals and the Kansas City Chiefs stadiums. So she knew that there was something else out there, outside of her housing project, outside of this dome, and she described feeling trapped in her neighborhood. She described a sense of complacency, drug use, crime, an antagonistic relationship with the police that led her to seek a sanctuary in school. So this is the map. That's the circle I was trying to get to show up before, that showed her home and the relationship to the stadium. So this is how she describes it then. She said, I remember that we could see that both the Kansas City stadiums, the Kansas City Royals and the Kansas City Chiefs from the complex. That may have played into why I felt like I lived in a dome. It was cool because we could always see the fireworks. We could sometimes see the crowd. Sometimes when they had concerts out there, we could hear that. There were certain aspects about living so close to the stadium that were really, really cool. You always knew when there was a game, especially night games, and see it. And I think it may be one of the reasons why, even though I felt like there was a dome over us, that I knew there was something on the outside, because I had seen it during the games. We had proof right there that there was another side, that this dome may be over us, but there was something more outside. And then she also said, she talked about her neighborhood, and she said, everything you can possibly think of stereotypically within an urban low-income environment happened where I live. Inside the dome, there were lots of drug dealers, teenage pregnancies, lots of just every negative stereotype that you can think about. But if you get outside the dome, it was different. Like so many people in my neighborhood, my mother was a drug addict on welfare and on food stamps. However, with those substance abuse issues and no other income, she spent that money on drugs. Therefore, we would go without stuff a lot of times. We had food to eat sometimes. There's a lot of stuff that we went without. And then another thing that she said about living in a dome, she said, I was told so many times as a kid, because I was from a single parent home where my mom was on welfare and was a high school dropout, didn't have any education, therefore I was going to be the same thing. Have kids out of wedlock as a teenager, be a drug addict. I was told I was never going to be anything because I was a young black girl from the ghetto. It never occurred to any of those adults that I had dreams and ambitions. It never occurred to any of those adults that I wanted to go to college. None of the adults ever mentioned college to me again after Mr. D, my 5th grade teacher, who we're going to talk about more in a minute. That hurt a lot. So I just remember thinking, I don't like this. I'm not a violent person. I don't do drugs. I absolutely have to get out of here. So that's the first scene, the first epiphany that we're building this manuscript around. The second is about busing in the black quota system, and this is where the historical context of Kansas City, Missouri school district in this particular era really comes into play. So they implemented this magnet program to end what they were calling hyper-segregation. As I mentioned before, they spent $250 million. They built 15 new schools and renovated 54 others. And this is how Siobhan experienced it. So Kansas City, Missouri School District had implemented a system for school selection that involved us filling out forms to select the next school we would attend. And students my age were constantly being told that we were piloting new programs. What they really meant was that we were guinea pigs. Another way that she experienced it was she kept being moved from school to school. So she talked about her elementary school that she went to only went up to 3rd grade. She said, I knew we had to choose a new school for me to attend 4th grade. I brought home the forms for my mom to fill out and sign to select a new school. She never did. Therefore, I ended up in Ashland Elementary School. It wasn't a real school, literally. Ashland was open for 1 year, and the school district opened it for all of us kids who didn't have a place to go. We were the outcasts. That year, I never had a teacher. Rather, our classroom was taught by a series of substitutes. Though our substitute teachers usually lasted a month or so, every one of them made a point to tell us how we weren't ever going to be anything because we were animals. I heard that almost daily. My sanctuary, my escape, my favorite place in the world had been taken from me because I was stuck at this Ashland school since KCMSD needed to stick us somewhere. So after that, I was wary of any other place and or school that the district would decide to stick me because to me it was fairly obvious that I didn't matter. Not only did I not matter, but I also didn't belong anywhere at all. So this is her personal account of how she experienced this system. So in 5th grade, she went to yet another school, and she was surprised to have a teacher, who she calls Mr. D, that actually recognized her as an advanced student and challenged her to be her best. It was the first time she had experienced that. So again, the school district sent home forms to be filled out for placement in middle school. And what she knew was that there was one middle school that tracked students to go to the college prep high school. There was one college prep high school. And so if you got into, it was Lincoln College Prep, so if you got into Lincoln Middle School, you got tracked to go to Lincoln College Prep, and that was the way that you went to college. All the other schools in the district were different. So eventually Siobhan gave up on her mother filling out forms, and she forged her mother's name on the document so she could get into the middle school of her choice. So this is in 5th grade, forged a document so that and chose Lincoln Middle School because she knew that was her ticket to get to college. So she said the parents were supposed to fill out the form and mail it in the district office. My mom didn't do this the prior 2 years, which is how I got put into Ashland and Askew. So it's no surprise that even though I bugged her daily about it, she didn't do it that year either. So that night I went home, I filled out the form myself. I already knew what school I wanted to go to because I wanted to go to college. And the only way a child in Kansas City went to college was by going to Lincoln College Preparatory Middle and High School. It even had college in the title. After filling out the form and forging my mother's name, I took it back to the school and gave it to Mr. D so the school could turn it in for me. And she also had talked about how she needed to give it to her teacher to turn it in because she couldn't get she couldn't get a stamp to mail it in. So Kansas City had implemented a black quota system, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And Siobhan found out about this system when she didn't get into Lincoln Middle School, but was put into another school with a classical Greek theme. Classical Greek meaning athletics. So to attract the white students that were living in the suburbs into the city schools that were at that point primarily African American, Kansas City School District established a quota that no school could be more than 60% African American. And they even had a nearly $1 million advertising budget to attract white students to come. And they had a $6.4 million budget for busing white students in. If a white student wanted to go to one of the schools in the city, to the magnet schools, and they didn't live on a bus route, the district would send a taxi for them. So Siobhan found out that she didn't get into the college prep middle school track. And she said, Mr. D, this is her 5th grade teacher, called the district in front of me. He was livid. He gave the person on the line his credentials, my information. He explained the situation. I'm not sure what they said, but you could see his patience slip as they spoke. And finally he said something like, I don't understand because out of all the kids in this district who need and deserve to go to Lincoln Prep, Siobhan is that student. She's testing post-high school on the ITBS test, and she's worked her tail off, and you're telling me there's no space for her? At the end of the call, he was visually upset. That's when he explained the district's quota system, and my schooling up to that point started to make sense. In fact, I hadn't went to any magnet schools at least. Basically, none of the district's magnet schools could be more than 60% black students in attendance, and since Lincoln Prep had hit their mark, I didn't get in. And that's when it became clear to me that the quota system was the experiment that we were piloting. So after middle school, Siobhan was placed in Central High School, which was another classical Greek magnet school. It had gained notoriety for its multi-million-dollar athletic facilities. It had an Olympic pool with an underwater viewing room and a 6-lane indoor track that rivaled most universities. And this is how Siobhan experienced it. She said, I wasn't athletic. I'd never participated in any team-oriented sports. I was actually hopeful about selecting my classes at Central because there seemed to be more flexibility in terms of math. Algebra was the default class that they placed incoming freshmen. I met with my advisor and told him I'd taken algebra in both 7th and 8th grade, and I didn't feel as though I needed to take it for a third year in a row. He told me that my middle school academics and standardized testing didn't matter because unless I had come from Lincoln College Prep, I had to take algebra. And that was the first direct slap in the face I received from the rules that had been put in place at Central. She also said that the administration at Central also used us as guinea pigs for a block scheduling. However, every school year they implemented a new kind of block scheduling, and eventually working it out so by the end of her junior year, I needed what they called 2 half credits, and there was no way to earn them because Central now counted each class as a full credit. So even though I'd followed the rules up to this point and taken a full course load, I was told in my senior year that I would have to attend summer school to graduate. That was another way Central and their rules slapped me in the face. So they had been, the school district, and the school had been implementing this block scheduling. She had been taking everything that she had been advised to do. 2 half credits didn't equal a whole credit, and so they told her that she was going to have to go to summer school in order to graduate. The thing was, by that time, she was living on her own. Going to summer school was not an option. She was working to pay her bills. One of her friends suggested that she get a GED, and she looked up the rules. You could not be enrolled in school for 6 months prior to taking the test. So she purposely dropped out. She dropped out so she would hit the 6-month mark as soon as possible. She got her GED at the same time that she would have graduated from Central. So she was trying to decide what to pursue for college, and she thought back to her high school aptitude test at the Classical Greek school. The aptitude test had come back, my results had come back as 1 engineer, 2 scientists, 3 psychiatrists. That was the first time I'd ever been officially told that engineering was a career that I could pursue. Unfortunately, I didn't know what an engineer was. I honestly had no idea. At that time, I associated engineering to trains, like a train engineer. Therefore, my first reaction was, this isn't right, I don't even like trains. I knew that regardless of what the aptitude test told me, I loved math. Math and science were my 2 favorite subjects. And accounting was the only career I associated with math. So I enrolled in a nearby college for accounting. Unfortunately, this college was in a suburb of Kansas City, which meant that you had to have reliable transportation to get there. So my second semester started, my boyfriend burned out the clutch on my car I'd recently purchased. I lost my transportation. So here she was at a multi-million-dollar athletic facility school, got an aptitude test back that said she should be an engineer or a scientist, and there was no one there to explain to her what an engineer was. There was no one there to follow up and discuss this aptitude test with her. Yes?
Was there no one there, or did she not know about someone being there? Or, was that not facilitated for her in particular, or was it?
It was not a college prep school. It was not. If you were not an athlete. Her description was, if you were not an athlete, you didn't get any attention. So she certainly was seeking out her advisors, trying to tell them what classes she wanted to take, and there was no advising about these career aptitude tests. So in the last part of her story, she said, it wasn't until my mid-20s that I actually figured out what engineering was. There was a movie called Proof that came out in 2005. That movie may have been a defining moment for me in my pathway to Clemson's engineering program, because something about watching Anthony Hopkins' character reminded me how much I love math. And after watching Proof, I Googled math and mathematician to learn more about the subject and available careers. And then she wrote that the internet wasn't available as a resource for her in the 90s when she got her aptitude test back. So interestingly, everything came together for me. Lo and behold, I came across engineering. There I was, 26 or 27, 10 years after I took the college aptitude test, and I finally found out what an engineer was, and it had nothing to do with trains. But in that moment, that's when I decided to go back to school, not for business. I was going to be an engineer. So at this point, I've taken you through Siobhan's story, tried to give her voice, tried to give her a voice, explaining the epiphanies, the scenes that were really salient for her. There's obviously a lot more to the story, right, from her mid-20s, what then got her into a two-year college and then to Clemson. The next thing that we're working on is this piece about her experience as a non-traditional student. And so that's see it? Yeah, we'll talk about that later. We're thinking about what the most salient aspects of those are, thinking about something to name that, because we might be able to, there might be something that comes up in her writing that we pull out and use as a name for that epiphany. And then we're trying to figure out how to deal with some of the issues about some hiccups with advising, with student services, and some other issues. So this is what I want to leave you with, and if we have, I know we're running close on time, but if we have time to talk about this either in this forum or throughout the week while I'm here or afterwards, I would love to have conversations about this. So what impact does Siobhan's story have on you? How could this autoethnography make a substantive contribution to engineering education? Are we willing to acknowledge how the pervasive claims of meritocracy, colorblindness, race neutrality, equal opportunity by educational institutions in the U.S. educational system serve to penalize some students and privilege others? How do we legitimize the experiential knowledge of students of color? And my last thought-provoking question is, how do we help students with varied life experience navigate our institutions? And then even more importantly, how do we revolutionize our institutions to be inclusive of all students' life experiences? So I'm going to turn it back over to Jeremy for time. I don't know what you want to do in terms of...
We have time for discussion.
Okay.
For at least 5 minutes.
Okay.
I have to go. We won't take it personally.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, in creating this project and manuscript, I'm interested in your feedback, in your ideas, maybe any answers to these questions that you might have.
I have a response to your questions, but it's actually a question to you. And it goes back to this idea of, you said at the beginning that you wanted to do an autoethnography instead of a narrative, which to me, from my limited knowledge of the method, means that you might want to put some of your like you said, your motivations in doing this. And so maybe that would be my question, which is, did you have a spark at some point when you heard Siobhan's story and said this? Not just that it's moving, because it's definitely moving and it's sad and
right.
and fascinating, but that you thought it had some relationship to what we should be doing in engineering.
Yeah. So the piece that we haven't talked about here is she is in engineering. She's at a major university in an engineering program, and she's in her second year, has persisted so far. So I don't view this story so much as being a sad story, but as a story that shows how racism is still affecting students. And this is a really, really overt case of it, right? I think that one of the things that it shows is that At Clemson, I think we assume that all of our students kind of come in with the same background. We basically assume they're, 18 or so years old, coming in from high school. Many of them, with their parents paying for their education. Certainly not someone in their mid-30s who has children, who has had all of these, kinds of experiences. And one of the things that she said at some point is that she wants to help engineering educators acknowledge that students come in, she used the word with baggage, but students come in, and I would try to reframe that in a more asset-based approach, but students come in with different kinds of different kinds of experiences that are all legitimate. And if we look at this from a community cultural wealth point of view, which was designed for Chicano and Chicana students, but I think we can think about extending it to other students of color. We see navigational capital is one of the things that is part of the community cultural wealth model. I mean, someone who in 5th grade is forging their mother's name so that they can get into college, at that age has an extreme amount of navigational capital. So I'd like to think of this in terms of not just this stark story that reminds us how institutions and racism and classism and sexism can have affected the students that are in our classroom and where they are sitting and what experiences they have had with that, but also what our students of color, non-traditional students, all of our students bring with them. What kinds of capital and wealth and knowledge do they bring? So the kind of navigational capital that she exhibited her entire life is an asset in helping her achieve. I believe is an asset in helping her achieve her goal of getting an engineering degree, and then we can look at it from those perspectives. So that's what really struck me, was not just that, like, oh my gosh, because the first time I talked to her, I didn't know anything about the history of Kansas City. I just got on and Googled it. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a thing. I've actually stumbled on a student who experienced this, and so we have to think. I think there's implications for U.S. educational policy, but there's also implications for us as engineering educators or whatever, educators to understand that students have not come in with a monolithic experience, and that we need to value the things that students come in. We need to recognize where they have where they have faced racism and sexism and classism and all kinds of other things, and how that affects their experience of learning and interacting in the classroom.
You have a question there about what impact does this story have on you, and so it reminds me of my story, and I appreciate this type of work, and I think there needs to be more of it, because Kansas City is one of the major cities in Missouri, but St. Louis is another one. Right?
And you grew up in St. Louis?
And I grew up in St. Louis, and I was one of the magnet students that got in. Right?
Okay.
And so I have but I was also a young girl from the ghetto, right? And so it's like there's some parallels, but then there are all these differences that I just wonder how the combination of stories may help us to understand, students' experiences. It's
right.
Just, I don't know. It has me thinking about my own story, and just that. We could have been side by side and lived in the same neighborhood, but had very different experiences and even similar aspirations, like not knowing what engineering is until long after, I first learned about it or something like that. So anyway, it has me thinking about my own story and the companion students that are on the other side
Interesting.
of a Siobhan.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about how we could think about giving voice to multiple stories. This is just one example, right? This is one example. This is the example that I have right now. This is the example I'm working with. I feel really fortunate. I mean, you saw the writing that she did. That was stream of consciousness off the top of her head. This has not been edited. I have not edited her writing. And so not only did I meet a student who had these experiences, I met someone who was willing to engage in a collaboration to help me tell her story, and I'm not having to, not having to work with her on the way that she's telling it. I'm just helping her piece it together. I'm showing her, well, this is how, this is what autoethnography is, and here, go read this, about autoethnography, and here's some stuff about critical race theory, and where do you see yourself here, and let's talk about reflexivity. And so, I have that structure in place that I can help her tell her story. But, one of the things that we've been talking about with the narrative community is the value of multiple stories.
Well, and as a follow-up on that, I was going to ask a question of and I'm not familiar with autoethnography, or I haven't done any autoethnography work myself, but is there like a comparative autoethnography? Because putting maybe Jeremy's story and her story in parallel to, I think in this era of alternative facts and such, could really help this work have even more impact.
So like I said, I'm moving into new methodological territory here, but I believe the answer is yes. So I believe that that's the case. And I'm also okay with breaking new ground. I'm not afraid to borrow elements to make it work. Yes?
Along those lines, would it also make sense to have these example from someone who didn't make it? I mean, they went through all these challenges, and obviously Jeremy made it, Siobhan's made it into engineering school. What about someone who couldn't? And then, as we're doing a comparison there, have that included. So.
I think that is absolutely an option. I feel like that talking about from more of an asset-based perspective of what kinds of things, even though she faced these challenges, what kinds of things helped her persist and succeed, could be more instructive for us as educators to acknowledge. Of course, there's she's the exception to the rule, right? She's the exception to the rule. No one else that she went to high school with, she talked about, made it out. And so she's the exception to the rule, but if we are studying what are making students successful, what they bring to the table, and how we can then make our classrooms, how we can make our departments, how we can make our curricula, how we can make our institutions inclusive of students who have these experiences, and we value and acknowledge those lived experiences, then I think that, my view is that I would rather focus on that piece than, what we know is everybody else who didn't. Because in my opinion right now is that we have enough evidence of what was going on. We can compare the historical context to her recollection and understand what the factors, the systemic factors at play are. So it just, there's different perspectives, and there's lots of ways that you could take this. Hi.
So since she's the one who made it, she was able to encounter all these various different people. Is there a way, or first off, how are you asking her to recollect her story? Is it is her recollection all of is it just chronologically?
Yeah, so that's what we decided to do. We thought that there might be we knew that there were different ways, but we decided to try one thing and start with it. So she's just started writing, and she started writing with pre-kindergarten, kindergarten. She was writing these sort of chapters about what she remembered from each grade level chronologically, and then with me looking at the whole story and understanding also somewhat of the historical context, we were able to pull out these epiphanies or these scenes or these themes that are roughly chronological, but are focused on particular really salient aspects of her experience.
Okay, so like it seems that since even after you get her paper and what she's done for more recently, you can take the whole thing and kind of see it as a whole. But as far as maybe like immediate, just to maybe help immediate people in the institution or anything like that, maybe is it possible to ask her what are your experiences with this certain person in this timeline, and based on their race or background, what did this person say, or what they did, how did it affect you through your education? Do you know what I mean?
I'm trying. Okay, I'm not positive I understand the question,
like,
but
for my experience, based on someone's race or education or their own background, it affected with what they said, either positive or negative.
I see.
It affected me differently. So like someone from, let's say, or my race, what they would say to me, if it was negative, it wouldn't affect me.
I see.
As opposed to someone who knew more or had more, or who was more legitimized in their opinion would have more effect on me.
So I think that what you're getting at shows that there's lots of different ways you can do an autoethnography, and we selected a way that just made the most sense, particularly to Siobhan and to myself. I think if you wanted to engage in that yourself, or that we could also take, you could do that if we could also take that approach that you've suggested, and we could go back and talk about those kinds of things. And she's doing that somewhat in the reflexivity piece that she's working on kind of offline. One of the things that we're experiencing right now is that this manuscript is ridiculously long at this point, and I hated putting all the slides up of just reading her quotes, but she wasn't here to present with me, so I wanted to do that, and so I think you have a really good idea. It's just how do you you have to put it into this what they're calling this aesthetic way that it flows together somehow, and it's held together. So I think there's multiple different ways that you could do that. So I think you have a really legitimate idea. It's just that for this project, we kind of outlined something that made sense to the two of us.
Okay. Hey! I actually just want to say I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think that there's a potential for it to open up discussions about other groups, because, I'm obviously not a black girl from the ghetto, but there's still things about Siobhan's story that I don't live with.
Okay.
I came from a pretty low SES background, obviously with a hearing impairment. In the 80s and 90s, there was a struggle to be mainstreamed. And then even in high school, there was a struggle. My first guidance counselor didn't want me to go to school in the city because, you want your cars and you'll get hit, which is insane. But there's other groups of people who are being marginalized in this way.
Yes.
And I think it's an issue with advising, with education, with larger systemic issues, that if we collectively have all these stories together, they're trying to say, you guys have a problem. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments, and I appreciate you sharing, part of your background, and Jeremy, you doing the same, because you are hitting on exactly what I'm trying to do with this. It's not just about Siobhan. Like, Siobhan's voice deserves to be heard, right? Her experiences deserve to be legitimized. But it's also everybody else who has, who is in a marginalized or a minoritized group. And so this part about what impact does Siobhan's story have on you, the fact that the two of you already have, and actually you as well, have spoken up and talked about pieces of your life that this resonated with or felt salient with, felt true, not truth with a capital T, but felt true. That helps give me confidence that what we're doing here could actually, start to challenge some of these things, and then that there could be a community, potentially capacity building is the word that we need to, the phrase that we need to use if NSF is watching. Capacity building around other identities. Like I said, I think this is a really, it's one person's story. She deserves her voice to be heard as a person of color who has experienced racism, as a person who's experienced classism, as a person who is now a non-traditional student in what's really a very traditional campus. We need for people to understand that when you have students in your classroom, they may be coming in with these experiences, and those need to be legitimized and they need to be valued, for what those lived experiences are. I'm off my soapbox now.
There are no more burning questions. Let's thank her. She'll be around the next few days, and of course available by email. If you would like to get in touch, share your thoughts or further questions. Thank you.